Hello, magandang umaga po sa lahat. Welcome to the December 2021 edition of the UP SLIS webinar series. This webinar series is organized by the UP School of Library and Information Studies. Welcome students and teachers of library and information science, information professionals, and all our friends in the Philippines and around the world. Welcome po. I am Paul Jason Perez, a faculty member from UPSLIS, your host and moderator for this webinar. This webinar is in high definition for an optimal viewing experience, and to ensure you can read the text in the presentation slides, please check and adjust the settings of this live stream to HD. Right now, you may also check the audio and adjust the volume to a comfortable listening level. You can also watch this webinar live on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page, UPSLIS. You can also watch our official channel on Twitch TV. That's twitch.tv/UPSLIS. This webinar is still part of our hashtag Webinar Wednesday and that we started July last year. The webinars are also part of the celebration of the 60th anniversary of UPSLIS. Before we continue, let me explain the mechanics for today's events. If you have any questions, you can send them anytime during the webinar. To post your questions, go to slido.com. That's www.slido.com and type in the code archives or hashtag archives. Again, that's slido.com with code archives. We will not entertain questions posted in the chat or comment section of this video. Again, to post your question, please go to slido.com and type in the code archives. We will show the website and code on screen throughout the talk. Alternatively, you can also use the QR code shown on screen to go to the questions page. We would love to hear your thoughts about today's webinar, so please watch out for the announcement containing the link for this webinar's evaluation. In the evaluation form, you can also suggest future topics that you would like us to discuss. You may also request for certificates or participation through our evaluation link. If in case you missed portions of this webinar, you may view this as a Facebook video or check our YouTube and Twitch channels. Okay, let's get things moving. We have yet another interesting and informative webinar this morning. I know you're all excited to start, so let me introduce our guest for today. Ricky Punzalan is an associate professor at the School of Information of the University of Michigan, where he teaches archives and digital curation. He's also on the steering committee of Michigan's Museum Studies program. He currently co-directs Recollect, a reparative connections to Philippine collections at the University of Michigan, a project that aims to develop both the framework and the corresponding set of practices of reparative work for the university's Philippine collections that were acquired during the U.S. colonial period. He studies the access and use of digitized anthropological archives and ethnographic data on academic and indigenous researchers. His research has had the greatest impact in the areas of virtual reunification and digital repatriation of cultural heritage collections. This research brought to the fore a critical challenge faced by underserved and indigenous communities and created dialogues between communities and cultural institutions. From 2018 to 2021, he served on the Council of the Society of American Archivists, the organization's highest governing body. Punzalan obtained his Bachelor of Library Science and Master of Library and Information Science degrees from UP Diliman, School of Library and Information Studies. He holds a PhD in Information as well as graduate certificates in Science, Technology, and Society, or STS, and Museum Studies from the University of Michigan. Everyone, we're very honored to have with us this morning our guest speaker, Dr. Ricky Punzalan. Hello, Sir Ricky.
Salamat. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Um, I grew up in the Philippines, as PJ mentioned, but I currently work and reside in the state of Michigan. So before I proceed, I would like to give a land acknowledgement. The University of Michigan is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land transfer to the University of Michigan. This was offered ceremonially as a gift through the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids so that their children could be educated. Through these words of acknowledgement, their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and their contributions to the university are renewed and reaffirmed. I'd like to thank the organizers of this lecture series, particularly Professor Paul John Perez, for the invitation to speak at this event, and SLIS Dean Mary Grace Golfo Barcelona for supporting this event. I'm particularly humbled and honored to be invited in the context of celebrating the 60th anniversary of my alma mater. And also the recent BOR or Board of Regents approval of the Master of Archives and Records Management, the very first in Southeast Asia, I believe. And I do think that SLIS has achieved a once in a generation feat for having this uh, program approved. I remember when I was still an instructor and an assistant, and then an assistant or assistant professor at SLIS, we were working on this endeavor. And I do think that it's, credit is actually should be given to the current leadership and faculty of SLIS for and everyone who helped in making this an achievement. Um, I owe much debt of gratitude to my mentors in SLIS who introduced me to the world of records and archives from the very beginning as a young professional. Yolanda Granda, Bobby Montesa, Emma Ray, and Dean Rosalie Faderon was actually my MLIS thesis advisor. And the late attorney Tony Santos was my undergraduate thesis advisor. I served under five deans at SLIS, the late Josie Season, who hired me, the late Maria Divina Pasco Cruz, who encouraged me to do my PhD, Dean Rosalie Faderon, Dean Viva Aguirre, Dean Johan Frederick Kabab, who all supported me throughout my doctoral studies. And also thanks to Deans Kate Obilie and Mary Grace Golfo of Barcelona for allowing me to re-engage with my SLIS family in more recent years. So let me go ahead and present my slides. So archivists have very long and a little bit problematic relationship with theory. And I just want to begin with this because I think there's a whole lot of ideas and misconception around archival theory. For instance, John Roberts, in his article "Archival Theory: Much Ado About Shelving" in the late 1980s, said, "Above all, it should be remembered that archivy per se is fairly straightforward, down-to-earth service occupation. It is not a liberal science. It is not to be confused with the cultural and historical treasures held by archival repositories. The knowledge that archivists must have to be effective can easily be summarized. They need to know procedures and technology. They need to know the ethics of the profession and what is expected of them. They need to know history, and they especially need to know their records. Everything else is either unnecessary or will fall into place well enough without the mediation of a priesthood of theorists." This particular article, you will see, will signal this kind of approach to theory in relationship with archives that is very suspicious, basically saying, no, there's no such thing as theory in the field, and people who are working on this, are basically engaging in a very futile practice. I would say that since this moment in archival history, I would say that the profession has actually evolved. The education in the area has also evolved, and the people practicing archival work and those who are engaged in archival theory have also evolved, and that I would counter this uh, argument into saying that actually from running away from theory, I think it's there's pretty much a good relationship with archival education and training, and also practice with theory. And a more recent way to think about archival work, which I will be talking about today, is looking at critical archival studies, and also looking at the social relevance of archives and archivists, and the work of archiving. So in the early days, this was very much also the attitude when I was still, being educated in archives and reading the early literature. There was, a kind of tension between practice and theory. What's the relationship with practice and theory, and whether there is actually an alignment? And the other question around theory in archives is basically, um, do we really have theory, or do we have a set of how to's, how to do X, how to organize materials, how to put them neatly in organizational arrangement that follows particular rules that will govern that particular practice? Is that really theory, or is this just a methodology that tells you how to conduct the work? There's also a tension between the roles of historians versus archivists. Most of the time, when archivists start talking about archival theory in depth, then they would say, "Oh, you're now venturing into the work of the historian, and you should basically stay within your lane, which is called archiving." And I'm prefacing my talk with these ideas, mainly to say that all these thinking have evolved, especially in recent years. There's also conversation happening, looking at archivists as keepers. You are keepers of the record, versus selectors. Especially when we started teaching appraisal and collection development strategies, and also when we apply preservation ideas on also assigning value to records that would have enduring value. So are we near keepers, or are we selectors, or are we shapers of history and social memory because of the virtue of archival practice? So this harkens back to the same debates, beginning with like the British archivist Sir Hilary Jenkinson and Theodore Schellenberg, who is an American um, archival practitioner and scholar. And the selection is the debate is whether archivists should be performing selection and appraisal. And in more recent years, there's no doubt that archivists are practicing appraisal and selection. So I just want to say that we've gone far from these debates into actually showing that some of these issues have been in modern practice been considered a little bit passe. There's also the notion of archival neutrality. In more recent years, we've seen um, uh, more challenges to the idea that the archivist is neutral, that that their politics should be should remain a personal kind of view, and that should not be applied in their work. But we are realizing, and we've realized over the years, that actually archivists and archival institutions are deeply political institutions, by virtue of our proximity to power, and sites of power, and also institutions that allocate or um, effect or implement those uh, rules and power relationships. So, so archival institutions are normally within the purview of the government, the church, corporate entities, or elite organizations, right? So basically, with given our proximity to power and institutions of power, the idea that archivists are supposed to just work within the purview of their institution without understanding the context of of the society in which they um, inhabit is being has been questioned. And in fact, this conversation around archival neutrality and and the politics of archives and archiving has been in conversation since the late 1970s, at least in the United States, in the literature available here in the US. So I would say, I kept saying more recent years, but actually, I'm speaking to like a longer time span, which is, I would say late 1970s to the early 1980s. Archival ideas are steeped in European or colonial traditions. Name an archival concept, and it will automatically be uh, based or developed in some in as a European model of practice. So let's say provenance and original order. These are European ideas. Even the notion of keeping something in perpetuity and use are also Western notions of keeping. If you do research and study uh, in the community context, you will know that not all cultures and not all regimes believe in preserving everything in perpetuity. In many ways, the European tradition of record keeping and preserving records uh, were basically transported into many other cultural and societal contexts. So there's really nothing neutral about archival work. As professionals, we choose to apply and adhere to this particular um, Western policies and notion of record keeping and archiving. So some common areas of exploration of late that I've seen that has evolved and that's been really uh, critical of archival ideas and archival work are, or I would call them sites of contestation within archives. Is for first is the notion of provenance and its application. For several years, archival thinkers have expanded the notion of provenance from the concept of looking at provenance as the creator of the record, which, for instance, somebody like me doing research on archival records uh, in the of the Philippines in U.S. Institutions, for instance, uh, understanding provenance means understanding the colonial official that was in the Philippines that collected records about Filipinos, and most of the time, it's in our finding aid, uh, it's almost like the people being documented, the subject of the record, are often not given the same. Um, highlight or focus in defining aid, because following the rule of provenance, you are assigning um, you assign this body of record with its creator, and most often it's the colonial administrator. So so recently, archival scholars have expanded the notion of provenance from, let's say, societal provenance. Tom Nesmith in Canada, in Manitoba, basically said, we have to acknowledge the subject of the records, not just the creator of the records, because doing so is we reassign the value of those records back to the people being documented by those records, not just the creator, who most of the time are people in power and people who are in charge of colonial administration. The Another concept is parallel provenance, which is the our colleagues in Australia has developed to say that there are multiple provenances and there are also parallel provenances, and that's not always the corporate entity that created it, but also other uh, entities that might be relevant and related to the record, and in most of the time also even the creator of the records just not acknowledged as such. um, there's many more notions of provenance. There's another notion of provenance that's about ethnicity, especially in a multi um, ethnic or diverse uh, immigrant countries like the United States, where a lot of people are from different nationalities or ethnicities. Ethnicity as a kind of provenance has been argued as one of the ways to expand provenance. So this is just one example of the changing application and nature of archival ideas. Also, in appraisal and selection, we've come a long way from saying we keep records based on their evidence and their information, or sometimes not perform appraisal at all, into performing appraisal and looking creating various models of appraisal and selection, and highlighting marginalized communities. Um, the role of archives in memory, in collective memory, and social memory, and versus its role in historical writing, right? Those are two different areas that I think more recently we've looked at archives as spaces of memory, of identity, of community relationships that's not basically based on official narratives or official writing of history, but more on the heritage side of um, uh, of archival work. There's also debates around permanence, what it means to keep something in perpetuity permanently, and in many respects, this is related to the conversation around appraisal and selection. Sometimes, making a distinction whether something is of permanent value, and then later changing your mind and saying we need to deaccession or reappraise the value of the record for our institution, and whether we're permitted to deaccession the material, and so forth and so on. There's also in the space of around permanence, there's also the notion of in the age of climate change, how is permanence going to as a concept figure, or how are we changing our notion of permanence? Because uh, at the end of the day, if we don't solve climate change, that this is a single threat to our existence as species, and also including our social institutions like archives and archival thinkers and scholars and practitioners are looking at climate change and permanence, and how we might react. And then there's the societal responsibility. What really is the role of archivists in society? Recently, I've been in conversation with some of my colleagues in archives, thinking about is it are archivists um, or archival institutions, are we really the arsenals of accountability, right? Do we keep record and or we keep records and archives to hold those who are in positions of power accountable, not just accountable in a more of uh, you know juridical sense, but accountable also historically, meaning we remember the injustice that's been done, that we are part of uh, remembering the crimes that's been committed, or because we hold those evidence. But we also know that while that may be true, we are not exclusively holding that responsibility. I'm sure colleagues in the Philippines know that journalists are also holding um, those who are in power accountable. Um, the academics, historians, and activists are also players in this. NGOs and other civic organizations. So the role of archivists as in the whole accountability process, I would say, is more of a shared responsibility rather than like as the main proponent of accountability. In practice, if you see, in many archival repositories, the role of the archivist is to keep those records, but activating those records often will have to be done in conjunction with other professionals, like as I mentioned earlier, journalists, for instance, or civic organizations, activists, and so forth and so on. So I think, I'm not saying that we don't have a role in holding people in power accountable, but we need to recognize that our responsibility here is at best shared, and it's not exclusive to archivists. So there are those new ways of thinking about our role in society and the responsibility of the archivist. So, in the context of the United States, you really cannot look at archival records and record keeping and archiving and archival institutions without looking at the problematic history of racial relations in this country. Slavery. Um, Also, before that, the genocide of indigenous and Native American populations in this country. More recently, looking at how those practices of genocide and slavery that had been the foundation, for instance, of like the United States as a country, also affected how we do archival work and archiving in the US, for instance. More recently, there's efforts across many institutions, mainly a whole lot of academic repositories, to do what they call reparative description, which is revisiting the finding aid, revisiting our descriptive terminologies. Oops, sorry, lights. Um, Revisiting these practices of description and metadata work, correcting the terminologies, because oftentimes materials are described incorrectly, in particularly in problematic and racist terminologies, so forth and so on. So revisiting that practice has been has been a preoccupation by some archivists of late, and some have argued, especially in the early years of doing this reparative work, that to change the finding aid is to change you know um, history, because the finding aid is part of history. But I do think that the role of the finding aid is to help people discover the materials. So if you're using terminologies that are inaccurate and wrong, then you won't find the items in the collection. More so if they are depicting certain cultures in you know um, uh, incorrectly, or with racist, outright racist terminologies, then more so the materials are ending up hurting people instead of encouraging access and use. So there's a whole lot of effort around reparative description. So reparative meaning repairing the harms and the damage of descriptive tools and terminologies that we have. More recently, we have seen, arguments around the feminist ethics of care. When we talk about archives, we say that we care for records, and we are stewards and keepers of these materials. But have we really focused on what it means to care? What's our responsibility of care in terms of records? Like, do we only care about records, or do we care about people and communities documented, represented in those records, and accessing those records? So there's a whole lot of vibrant conversation around what it means to perform archival work as a work of care. um, and there's also the invisible and precarious labor of archivists. Most of the time, more recently, I've been seeing this back and forth debate between historians and archivists saying, did you really discover it in the archives, or you found it because it was meant to be there because archivists have done the labor and the work of making them available? So is it truly discovery, or you found something that was meant to be discovered because we create finding aid and then we've done work on preserving them? But there's also the whole world of precarious labor among archivists, where it seems like, at least in the United States context, it doesn't seem to be, there's less and less permanent job in archives. The security of archival work, especially now during COVID, has really been very precarious and unstable, and the salary has been decreasing. So there's also that context around, like, what does it mean to do archival work, and the meaning of archival work, when our labor, the work that we do, is always almost under acknowledged and invisible, and also we are not paid well enough to do this particular work. There's also a thread around secondary trauma that I think is worth discovering. When you do, and I'm sure many of our colleagues who process materials that contain, horrific imagery, uh, racist description, and you encounter this on a daily basis, it could re-traumatize you. And if we are not careful in archival work, uh, those who access our records could also be experiencing trauma in these records when we just make them available without any warning whatsoever, or official training. Again, this goes back to what my point earlier around looking at the ethics of care, and that includes being trauma informed, and then knowing how to um, react when us as professional archivists and archival educators and also when our users experience the uh, uh, re-traumatization by way of access to our records. And then more recently, or there's an expanding discussion, conversation around community archives that are bifurcating in many ways. Like the first thread here is basically how do mainstream traditional archival institutions that have been in operation in universities and other entities, uh, how can we work well with the communities that we serve, and how do we document minoritized, underrepresented communities to make sure that they are represented in our institutions. There's that particular thread, but there's also a very exciting thread that is community archives from the community standpoint, without the purview of official or state or institutional archives. Like what archiving looks like when it is done by communities themselves, not by mainstream traditional and Western institutions. How does it look like, and how can we learn from that work? So they're not always complementary, because sometimes uh, what's good for the community uh, may not be uh, you know congruent with the values of the institution, so therefore they need to be separated. But there are moments too when institutions work very well with communities, and they could identify the existence of those uh, you know um, the, the 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 more of a reciprocal relationship between community and institutions. So the world of community archives and the literature and community archiving is really interesting, and it has broadened our perspective around archives and archiving and archival theory. So in 2017, my colleagues and I published an introduction to critical archival studies, which is a special issue in the Journal of Critical and Library Information Studies, where we defined critical archival studies as those approaches that explain what is unjust with the current state of archival research and practice. Uh, and it posit practical goals for how such research and practice can and should change, and provide the norms for such critique. Um, in this way, critical archival studies, like critical theory, is emancipatory in nature, with the ultimate goal of transforming archival practice and society writ large. As an academic field and profession, critical archival studies broadens the field's scope beyond an inward, practice centered orientation, and builds a critical stance regarding the role of archives in the production of knowledge and different types of narratives, as well as identity construction. So, the examples I mentioned earlier are all very much in line with this new way of looking at archival studies with critical lens. So first, like what is unjust in the current state of archival research and practice, meaning who are the people we neglect, that we further minoritize by not collecting their records. So I'll give you a good example. In a university context, often when we collect records, we collect records of um, famous alumni, uh, renowned professors, um, and perhaps people who achieved something in society, however you define it. But often we fail to collect records uh, that document the society around us, not just based on these institutional records that's been created and then records donated by prominent individuals, but those who have been in existence in society. So what does that mean? So for instance, in your immediate vicinity, are people living in your immediate vicinity represented in your archives, for instance, and if not, then you have to think about whether you are practicing and doing research in archives that's actually representative of your society and the people and communities around you. And then also, how do we do this work? So far we are exploring various ways, alternative means of doing archival work that's not just doing something over and over, but challenging our own assumptions. And so um, I do think that the intervention of critical archival studies in archival work has been really fruitful and has opened many avenues of work, as some of those I've mentioned earlier, and when I went and looked at these different areas of change in the field. Um, there's also the more recent scholarship on the social justice impact of archives. Here, Heather McNeil and co-authors in their article, "If there are no records, there is no narrative." Um, they say that social justice impact of archives. They define it as an outcome or change in an individual or community's relationship to the world in regards to social justice, which results from records and or processes of creating, keeping, activating records. I really like this perspective. You're looking at the result of archiving and the social justice impact of archival practices and what it means, because it makes us think uh, more deeply into the social relevance of archives and what it's contributing in society. um, Here's another study on the community impact of archives. Here, they identify three areas of impact w- of community archiving. So first is ontological impact, meaning seeing oneself in history. If you can imagine yourself to be part of a minority group or minoritized community, and you are so accustomed to not seeing yourself in history, but community archiving allows for those recognition, um, and, for your own history not to be erased. There's also epistemological impact, the empirical proof of a community's existence, that we exist, we were here. And finally, the social impact, which is a sense of inclusion or social belonging. Archiving and archival work should usher us into this feeling of social belonging, and social belonging in the sense that you think that you are um, equal, and that you are part of the diverse world around you, and that kind of acknowledgement. The other areas that I think, and over the years I've done research on, like areas of impact that we could examine, in archival work, is around, knowledge, professional discourse, attitudes, institutional capacity, policy, and relationships. I can go over them quickly. So, first is, knowledge, whether archival records are being used in formal and informal settings, in university courses, uh, and also in informal settings, like for instance, in after school hours with librarians, and looking at records, or in museum educational context, for instance. Um, how are digitized content being shared or used to build knowledge about areas of interest to users? Are we building new knowledge out of those records that we have? And what programs are in place and how are they affecting language revitalization for indigenous communities trying to, relearn traditional language and also ritual and tradition in curricula and cultural heritage and the like. So we can ask like what's the role of archives in knowledge production and learning and all of that. The next is like the one societal impact that we could examine is the in terms of attitudes. How are archives being used or circulating within a particular community or non-community contexts? Is it changing people's attitudes about cultures or identities that's not theirs? Like, do we see some kind of acceptance of other communities and other cultures because of the records that we have? How are public or professional attitudes changing as a result of projects or access to archival sources? You know, is there a shift that we can see uh, in relation to the exhibitions that we're putting up and also the publications that we are releasing out of these records? And then professional discourse and how are terms, language, objects, or images being used in literature, conference sites, blogs across professional platforms. Here, it could be, the archival profession, or it could be also, other professional settings like changing, discourse here means, language, how we describe the work that we do and how we affect overall professional attitude and practices, meaning my role or my perception of my role in society as an archivist has changed because of my continued access to archival records and processing them. And the same thing is true for allied professions like historians and the like. So how are we documenting and showing those? um, the next is institutional capacity. There, we need to have a way of showing that the more we do archival work and archival practice, the more um, expansive our capacity uh, becomes, in terms of our capability, our power to get things done, achieve things like changing funding structures, guidelines, and cultures around our work. Are we becoming sophisticated designers, users, or implementers of technology because we're doing digital preservation, for instance? And also, finally, I think, I'd like to look at policy. Uh, Field-wide standards, protocols, and guidelines, are they changing as a result of, archival education and work? For our legislators? Are they making laws, enacting policies locally or nationally because of access to records? I think that would be a great way to make some kind of societal impact and show our relevance in society. And then relationship. So are we gaining more reciprocal relationship and increase in trust because we are showing historical practices or identities through our records in particular in specific ways that inspire better relationship to build trust between individuals? I do think that especially in the age of misinformation and disinformation and also erasure of um, historical events in the Philippines, I do think that it's really important that we demonstrate that archival records lead to better relationships between communities and between people and between individuals. So my final thoughts, because I do want to hear questions, is that I do think that archival work is nothing if not critical. I think we should teach archival thinking. You know, how would you uh, think of this as an archivist, not necessarily archiving, and we can unpack this later, what constitutes archival thinking, right? Second is like sometimes you need to dismantle in order to build. So the problems we face are systemic, structural, and founded on white supremacist colonial logics that are baked into our systems, processes, and day-to-day practices. So sometimes you have to rethink those processes and dismantle them to change them so that we can build new ones, right? And I do think that there's a whole lot of space for that. So also neutrality is not an archival imperative. If you read the Society of American Archivists Statement of Values and Code of Ethics, and many other ethical codes, neutrality is not really an archival imperative, but accountability, diversity, advocacy, selection, and social responsibility are, enshrined in our ideas of what it means to be an archivist. And the true measure of archival success must be in terms of the community relationships initiated, created, and sustained as we do archival work. And I do think that we shouldn't measure our success in terms of whether you've processed how many boxes or you've digitized how many items, whether you've ingested how many digital data or digital files that you have. But I think we should be measured or valued for the results of these activities. So thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions. And I hope I got you all thinking and inspired. Salamat po.
Wow. Salamat, Sir Ricky. I'm sure our viewers learned a lot. I, for one, sure did. I think it is a very good lecture, especially for those intending to enroll in the Master in Archives and Records Management. We actually have actually several questions waiting, no, and we will be addressing them in a few minutes. For those who just tuned in, this is our UP SLIS webinar series organized by the UP School of Library and Information Studies. To our audience, if you have any questions for our speaker, you can go to slido.com and type in the code archives. You can also use the QR code shown on the screen to go to our questions page. Please check the previously posted questions and the vote questions you want to be prioritized. You can also comment on the questions if you have similar stories or experiences. Don't forget to include your name and email address in the question so that if ever we can't entertain them on air, we can send you a reply. Some announcements before we proceed. The UP SLIS is proud to announce its new graduate program, the Master in Archives and Records Management, or MARM, commencing academic year 2022 to 2023. This is the first of its kind in Southeast Asia. The MARM is a 34-unit, 2-year graduate program that provides students with the knowledge and skills required to work in and develop archives, special collections, record centers, and other memory and collecting institutions. This program addresses the need for formal education on archives and record keeping in the region necessary to support and document critical organizational decisions and activities that will help ensure efficiency, transparency, and accountability in both public and private sectors, and to help preserve and promote our cultural heritage, collective memory, and identity. The program addresses these needs by providing students with strong theoretical and practical foundations and experience on the effective, efficient, and ethical management of records and archival materials. The practical and theoretical engagements to be provided by the program will prepare the students and future archives and records professionals to be historically and culturally conscious and reflective while further enriching their experience with information for civic engagement and participatory governance. Thus, the MARM program balances the pragmatic and business aspects of records management and the historical and cultural dimensions of archives. Please visit our website upslis.info, for more information on the program. The UP SLIS is pleased to announce the release of the 41st volume of the Philippine Journal of Librarianship and Information Studies, PHJLIS, or formerly Journal of Philippine Librarianship, or JPL. This latest and special issue of the PHJLIS celebrates our 60th founding anniversary and at the same time honors the efforts of various people and institutions behind the progress of LIS education in the Philippines. The issue is a compendium of articles from 10 different library schools around the archipelago, and we hope a step towards a developing comprehensive picture of today's LIS education in the Philippines. PHJLIS is an open access journal. You can view its issues at phjlis.org. Articles are available free for download. You may also submit your articles by logging into the same website. If you have any inquiries, you may send an email to editor@phjlis.org. Thank you to those who already purchased our SLIS Coffee Table Book. For those of you who have no copies yet, you can now pre-order for our next print run by going to bit.ly/SLIS-CTB. For those of you who have fond memories of UP SLIS, and you want to submit your best, funniest, weirdest, oddest, scariest, sappiest memories in SLIS through a project called hashtag I Remember. If you have something that you want to share, please go to iremember.upslis.info. You might also want to check out our 60th anniversary online exhibition at 60.upslis.info. Also, the Kaagapay project for UP BLIS students of the UP Library Science Alumni Association, or UPLSIA, is still ongoing. We want to ensure that every BLIS student is equipped with the required tools or gadgets for remote learning. The Kaagapay project is in support of the program of the UP system, Kaagapay sa pag-aaral ng mga scholar ng bayan. You may donate in cash or in kind to help our BLIS students who may be struggling with remote learning. You may send your inquiries to uplsaa.inc@gmail.com. Again, that's uplsaa.inc@gmail.com. And finally, the UP SLIS is still accepting donations for the construction and renovation of our new SLIS building. Here is your opportunity to contribute to the UP SLIS and LIS education in the country. For your donations or other inquiries, you may contact us via email at admin@slis.edu.ph. Also, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow our Twitch TV, and like our Facebook page, UPSLIS. That's UPSLIS on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch. And also, shout out to our viewers from Cosca, Dumaguete City. We also have viewers from DepEd Davao Occidental and from West Visayas State University main campus. Good morning to all of you. Thank you for joining us this morning. Okay, Sir Ricky, are you ready? Okay. We have some questions here. The first one is, hi, Professor Ricky. Do you think the RA 9470, or the National Archives of the Philippines Act of 2007, or its IRR, is in need of a few amendments? Example given is, while even NAP, or the National Archives, acknowledges that archives and records managers benefit from LIS background, recruitment documents do not officially mention that in their requirements. Sir Ricky, what are your thoughts about the RA 9470?
Well, unfortunately, I've been out of circulation and like archival work in the Philippines. That I don't have a expertise and thorough background in the law. Um, but I do think that like given that particular example, it does sound problematic that you require an LIS degree, for instance, but without any specific identification of what archival knowledge that you may have taken, and it's I do think that with the new master's program, and then also like a specialization within or Bachelor of Library Information Science um, degree, that with specific archival course. I know that because I used to teach some of the archival courses. We should probably be able to articulate those expectations, and if it's not in the law, I think we should be able to at least you know fix fix that. And I don't know if I don't want to get into a debate of whether amendment is necessary, or what we require is a kind of cultural shift, uh, and that, because there's always danger in relying in law, because as cultures change, attitudes change, and also competencies and expectation of professional duty are all ever changing ideas. And so what you do is basically you're playing catch up, right? As soon as you enact a law, it's almost instantly you realize that it's not in tune with more contemporary ideas, and then you have to amend it again and change it again. So I'd rather advocate a more kind of institution based approach, meaning, well, as an institution, that you're looking for an archivist with an LIS background. So, you may want to take a look at, like the courses they've taken, and ask them in an interview how they've done it. I would rather see it that way than, uh, you know, or best of both worlds, maybe amend the law and change the practice and culture around hiring. Um, but yeah, I'm so sorry because I'm yet to read the entire law and understand it and do the implementing rules. And even if I've read that without any legal background, I would be very uncomfortable making specific suggestions. But I would rely on my colleagues over there who completely understand the law and may even be teaching the provisions of the law to provide the necessary suggestions on like areas for amendment. But I'm actually very surprised that that there's a law that's in effect, that we can at least reference, right? Some countries may not even have that.
Thank you,
I
Sir
hope I
Ricky.
answered the
How
question.
about there in the United States, diba, there are some qualifications or certifications that employers are looking for when they're hiring for archivists. How is it happening there in the United States?
It's mainly, they would say, you must have received a degree from an ALA, American Library Association,
Mhm.
ALA is accredited institution, and then there's the Society of American Archivists has actually a site. If later on, I can share via chat, and will people see it? Um,
Yeah, we can post it in our uh,
yeah.
streaming video.
So there's the Society of American Archivists has resources around there's a directory of archival education which I can share, that that would indicate the places where uh, people may have gotten their degrees. There's also the guidelines for a graduate program in archival studies created in 2016. I believe this is currently being revisited to to give an update. But um, if you look at the guidelines for graduate program in archival studies, it spells out the curriculum, uh, how the faculty component, and the mission and goals of such education. SAA itself has a continuing education program that's available, that people could take. There's also a certified archivist as an organization, and that there's an exam to become a certified archivist. That some people I know, after taking their masters, they take a certified archivist exam. Not everybody. Like for instance, me, I'm not a certified archivist. I did not take that exam myself, but I'm a professor of archives. So there are all these options that would signal expertise in the area. Uh, but yeah, but the first qualification that they will say in a job ad is like basically describing the responsibilities, and they are obviously archival responsibilities. And then, like, let's say processing of archival records, for instance. And then and qualifications, minimum qualifications: master's degree in archives or records management or related field, like for instance history, for instance, from an ALA accredited program. So all those will signal archival qualification.
Thank you for explaining those qualifications. We'll be sharing the links to our viewers later. Thank you, Sir Ricky. We still have a lot of questions here. There's a question here in the Philippines. A lot of institutions or organizations don't even have archives. Do you think we need the archival theories, or should we develop first our technology and then think about the archival theories after?
Well, I actually do not separate theory from practice. Meaning, how can you, what rules of archiving, procedures of archiving, and technologies of archiving will you implement if you don't have the necessary theoretical underpinning to implement them? Like for instance, okay, I will establish an archival program in my institution, and then I will organize I will arrange and describe the records following provenance and original order. That means you're already engaging in archival theory. Now, your relationship with that theory as you implement, meaning saying, well, this doesn't work for my institution and for my needs, I will deviate a little bit, and here's why I'm deviating. um, is simultaneously happening as you're organizing your records. So don't try to dichotomize theory and practice, and also don't make them preconditions of each. Meaning, oh, I want to establish the archives first before I think about theory, because I do think that you can never uh, practice archival work without any kind of relationship with the theoretical foundation of the field.
So yeah, there's really this like a false dichotomy. Thank you, Sir Ricky. This next question is actually related to the first question earlier. How do you feel about archiving being classified under the practice of librarianship in the Philippines? So just to give more context, now currently, Sir Ricky, for example, in the curriculum of BLIS, there are requirements for introduction to archives and records management, and also even in the board exam, I believe there are some questions on archiving and records management. And currently, the practice of archives is in a way implied that it's part of the LAS profession. So how do you feel about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's I have a tricky feeling. Well, first is, for instance, strategically speaking, to grow the number of archivists in the country, we need to be very practical about how we train people to become archivists. In the context of the United States, actually, there's no bachelor's degree in archives or library science. Here, um, LIS and archives are master's degree programs. There's no bachelor's, and that's something that's unique in the Philippines, and some parts of the world that we do have an undergraduate degree. Whenever I come to speak here, once I gave a lecture at the Library of Congress, and I told them, I have a bachelor's degree in library science, and people were like so in awe that I had access to librarianship training in the undergraduate level. But I do think that strategically speaking, if it's taught correctly, there's I could only see it as a strategy to expand the workforce and the qualified people. Again, my caveat is if it's taught correctly. Why am I saying this? Because here in Michigan, we only have one degree. It's called Master of Science in Information. And you can take a cluster of courses called archives, and that would make you an archivist. And you can apply for archival jobs. But potentially, you could have also taken library courses and also work in academic libraries if you choose to. With the convergence of libraries, archives, and museums, I do think that strategically speaking, if we could um, teach broadly to these areas, so where it doesn't matter where you work, as long as you learn how the work is done, another perspective here is, at least with the dwindling number of jobs for librarians, including archivists, uh, your degree should also be applicable to non-archival and library settings because you did learn important skills. So I'm personally speaking, I'm all for broad learning. But especially if you have the right uh, learning and orientation and education, I do think that there shouldn't be like a single destination for these degrees. Like meaning, if you have a library science, you end up in a library. Because I know for a fact that some people, even in my friends in the undergrad there in UP, not all of us ended up in a library. Some became lawyers, became whatever they wanted to be. So I also want to embrace that kind of diversity. So again, to me, I would always be in favor of broad teaching as long as the teaching is done correctly. I will not fault someone who's gone through an LIS and archives training simultaneously, right? But I think the question being is the assumption that archivists are a type of librarians, and that's a classic debate. Are we a type of librarian? Are we a type of historian, or are we our own profession? So in my perspective, we are our own profession. Regardless where you got your education from, you can practice that profession anywhere at the same time. So to me, I am okay with the idea of getting your archival training from a library school with some library education and becoming a professional archivist because knowing the history of, for instance, of the master's degree, I know it's not easy to just establish a degree program. MARM is actually one of the unique programs because normally programs are MLIS and with specialization in archives. At least in the US, other there's one in Canada. In University of British Columbia where it's the Master in Archival Studies, right? But most of the time the degree is MLIS or Master of Information Studies or something like that.
Thank you very much, Sir Ricky. Another question here. I think this one is from someone doing a research. Sabi niya dito, Sir Ricky, I'm doing a family history research and my white friends can trace their ancestors up to the 1800s, but my Filipino heritage doesn't have any records. Any advice?
Actually, I'm not a family historian nor a genealogist, so but there are resources for genealogical research. Unfortunately, I don't have expertise in that area.
Okay. Let's look at the next question here. Sir Ricky, in the context of the Philippines, what topics relating to archives and social justice relevant should we be talking about?
Oh, yeah, that's a fantastic and excellent question. Uh, it's election season in the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that you should probably pay attention to is the how um, historically we've we haven't really reckoned with basically the dictatorship and martial law, the human rights violation that happened, both in that context and more recently. And so I do think that one uh, good conversation to have is like, what's the role of our archives and archiving in at least in the production of credible memory of of our own history, the more recent history, like meaning when we became a republic. I think there's a whole lot of focus right now around preserving the Spanish records, and all that. But I really am convinced that we should focus more on uh, the records when we became a republic, from the Commonwealth era to the present. And then certain administrations, we shouldn't live in a society when people could claim uh, and uh, historical facts and events, to their favor by erasing those historical, like. So I think archivists, as arbiters of social memory and history, and in the business of preserving those evidence, should be discussing this, right? And I say this because not necessarily because I want to engage in a political conversation, but I do think that the long history of oppression and marginalization in the country is also what's allowing for certain forces to remain in power. And um, and so um, if we engage in conversations and show archival records that provide evidence to marginalization and oppression and human rights violation, like that would be a big step in making the right choices of the leadership, also having informed policies around what to do, in certain like social um, programs. Also holding people in power accountable to the public. So I do think that could be a good area. Another is, there's a long history of, um, I would say, um, marginalization of indigenous cultures in the Philippines, like land grabbing, certain communities being caught in the crossfires of, different um, political forces, and the military and all of that. I mean, where are those records that provide evidence that of the relationship of indigenous communities with their land, and for those not to be taken away? Uh, Also, another area is how much of our archival history and record keeping traditions are colonial, uh, Spanish and American. Like maybe one way to discuss this is like how we are replicating the same mode of thinking, colonial mode of thinking, by uh, following those same colonial logics. Excuse me. So there are those, so I would say colonization, um, more recent history that are being erased, documenting the republic and its growth, and the historical mistakes, holding our public officials accountable, um, you know decolonization, and indigenous concerns. Those are some of the topics that I would be really interested in hearing.
Sir Ricky, it seems that there's really a lot of work, no, and research opportunity for even for our future MARM students. Thank you, Sir Ricky. This next question is still related to that, and I think some of the answers you mentioned earlier addresses this question, but maybe you want to add something more about this because the question is any advice on promoting Marcos atrocities to correct historical revisionism. Nako, Sir Ricky, napakarami po niyan sa TikTok tsaka YouTube.
Yeah, and the power of archives and archivists, as I said earlier, is quite limited. Like we belong to, let's say, we it's a shared responsibility. Historical accountability um, is a shared responsibility. So, to address this, archivists must learn how to work with journalists. We must learn how to work with civic societies, or activist organization. So the thing is, most of the time, we shy away from working with others. We kind of keep ourselves into the reading room or processing, and we say, this is my job, I'll keep doing this. But if we don't work with other infrastructures of accountability, then to activate the records that we keep, then we will not be able to do much. What's a well kept, well preserved archive when it's not used and activated, and in the context of historical accountability, right? And to me, this is regardless of you know um, the historical event that you want to document or discuss, right? It could be even the Aquino administration, or it could be the Macapagal administration. Holding, keeping these records about these historical figures and administration will require a lot of collaboration with other institutions. I say this because recently we've done a study on um, the preservation of email. And then we realized that, at least in the US National Archives context, while archivists there are doing a great job, um, their power to hold government accountable is fairly limited. Uh, Not because they are consciously limiting themselves, but there are structures in place that would limit the exercise of that power, like uh, being under the office of the president, the law not expansive enough. So I do think that we need to understand our relative place in this historical reckoning and learning strategically how to work with other um, professionals and civic organizations and activists to do the work, because we shouldn't be seeing this as the mere work of the archivist. We are one of the instruments of accountability in society.
Yeah, that's a very beautiful answer. Actually, sir, dun sa program that was developed in the MARM, part of the curriculum is archives advocacy. And I think that is something that the students or future students can find helpful in combating no, historical revisionism. Sir Ricky, the next question here, I don't know, you might have heard about this. Recently, there have been book banning happening here in the Philippines
Mm.
from the NTF-LCAC, the National Task Force on Ending the Insurgency. No? So the question here, Sir Ricky, recently the NTF-LCAC is banning subversive books. How can we ensure long-term access for these resources?
Well, ensuring long-term access means you don't burn them. uh, and I can't believe that, I mean, it's not just in the Philippines. There are certain states in the US that started banning books on critical race theory, for instance, like the history of slavery in this country, because they say it's a divisive topic and so forth and so on. It's very strange that in my lifetime I would see this, because I thought, the world of library and information has advanced so much, so that I do think that this was like, I can't believe we're still discussing this, because we're no longer in the 1930s or the 1920s, when but there's like a library bill of rights, there's freedom to read, there's so many other, ethical instruments that should guide uh, our thinking around this. I think book burning or book banning is uh, as a public policy is ill-informed, not based on any um, modern uh, conception of learning and lifelong education and universal access to knowledge. It belittles um, you know uh, the reader. Like, we don't trust the reader to make an informed decision around what they read. Like, for instance, somebody like me who uh, was educated at the University of Philippines and read a whole lot of Marxist and Leninist literature. I did not become a Marxist. So, something like that, like, so I've read a lot of books around, crime and arson and you name it, but I did not become a criminal. So, uh, just an example of how ridiculous these ideas are. They're not based on any scientific or reasonable reality. These are policies enacted by people who are afraid of becoming, I don't know, maybe irrelevant in society, or want to assert their tendencies to dictate their own idea. So I just think it's such an unfortunate measure to be confronted with, or to be dealing with in this contemporary history. It's just bizarre. It has an air of, the 1930s and the 1920s. We've moved on as since then. So anyway, the best way to preserve these records and to keep them is to counter those restrictive laws and policies, and to confront whoever is endorsing these ideas, and make them realize that, this is counter to the democratic ideals and process of lifelong learning and universal access to information. This shouldn't exist in a democratic society.
I agree. I agree. Thank you, Sir Ricky. We still have a few questions here, but in the interest of time, Sir Ricky, maybe we can answer a couple more questions. Is that okay with
Yep.
you?
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
fine.
The question here is, let's choose this one. What can you say about the status of archival studies in the Philippines?
Well, with the approval of the new program, I think it's healthy and doing well. But this is the University of the Philippines program. I cannot speak of the rest of the country. When I was still there, uh, it was to me, and this was from 2000 to 2006. It was an exciting moment to become an archivist. There's so much, uh, promise to archival work. Um, Cultural heritage work, like mainly, like, like the National Museum of the Philippines, the National Library, like, were very promising institutions. And then there's like the law, there's the licensure exam. Um, so I was really excited about this, and so this development of the master's degree, there's how many generations of archival educators attempted to do this uh, before me, during my time, and then when I left, and then it finally got approved. So I do think that there's a whole lot of hope and promise around that. Um, I looked at the curriculum. I particularly like the curriculum. If given a chance, I would be happy to teach some of the courses because they're really exciting courses. So, I would say, yeah, it's great. But whether that translates into the whole country is another matter. Maybe other programs should follow suit or emulate. Uh, you know, because I think um, embedding archivists in every organization is a kind of lifelong dream that we have, right?
Thank you, Sir Ricky. And I'm sure this is just the beginning. We're very happy and excited to have you, for future endeavors or projects with regard to the program. Thank you, Sir Ricky. The final question here is, Sir Ricky, what are your final thoughts? Do you think the National Archives of the Philippines should have an official statement on historical revisionism, disinformation, that are happening in our times? uh, the the s- the audience said, I recently attended one of their webinars and they said they don't have such a statement or sign. Personally, I cannot verify if the NAP recently released any statement, but let's say, what do you think should be the position of a national archives in times like this when there's a lot of disinformation that's happening?
Well, my model here is the National Archives of the United States, and the U.S. National Archives will release statements uh, to that effect. When there was when the National Archives hear that, for instance, there's a destruction of records of immigrant detainees by customs and borders people, they issue statements like that, condemning the destruction of records. When uh, when the Bush administration was not willing to transfer its electronic records and email, especially the office of the vice president, you know, the National Archives here issued a statement, and I think I don't know if they sued or threatened to sue. So it's a very active organization. Um, Again, it has its powers, but it also has its limitations. So yeah, I think as an agency, the National Archives should issue a statement, but not just the National Archives. The National Committee on Archives of NCCA should issue a statement. The Society of Filipino Archivists should issue a statement. Like all these organizations, it cannot just be one. Yeah.
Maraming salamat, Sir Ricky, for entertaining all of those questions. There has been a lot and we really appreciate your time. Maraming salamat po, Sir Ricky. At this juncture, we would like to award the Certificate of Appreciation to our speaker. And the certificate reads, the University of the Philippines School of Library and Information Studies presents this Certificate of Appreciation to Ricardo L. Punzalan, PhD, for delivering his valuable webinar entitled Archives and Social Relevance, the Promise of Critical Archival Studies as part of the 2021 UP School of Library and Information Studies lecture series in celebration of its 60th anniversary, given this first day of December 2021 at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, Quezon City. Signed, Paul Jason V. Perez, the SLS faculty and head of the SLS at 60 Committee, and Mary Grace P. Golfo Barcelona, Dean of UP SLS. Sir Ricky, maraming salamat po.
Maraming salamat, and it's my pleasure to speak.
Sir Ricky, do you have any projects to promote? Do you have any speaking engagement that you would like to promote to our audience?
Well, one thing that I'm doing right now is I'm heading this project, co-leading this project called Reconnect Recollect. If you Google University of Michigan Reconnect Recollect and reparative connection to Philippine collections at the university, I'm doing this great effort to locate Philippine artifacts, museum artifacts, and records, archival materials at the university so that they become more accessible to Filipinos in the US and in the Philippines. So I'm very excited about that project. I'll probably be talking about that project in the future because it gives me a lot of excitement, and also gets me grounded to both my position here at Michigan as a faculty member and also as a Filipino scholar and as an archivist. It helps me work with colleagues and students and collections in the university. Michigan is a big collector of Philippine materials, given its historical involvement in the colonial administration. So there's a whole lot of Philippine materials here. So I'm lucky to be in this university to be able to do that research. I'm thinking of in the future visiting the Philippines. So like I really look forward, like maybe when we're allowed to travel.
Yeah.
And once that happens, I'll let you know because I would really want to revisit my SLIS family and see how I could help grow the MARM program and maybe even teach and do some kind of outreach there. So yeah, and also, oh, by the way, I don't know if anyone here listening is a member of the Society of American Archivists. I'm running for vice president, president elect. So if you are a voter, member of the Society of American Archivists, vote for me. Salamat.
Thank you, Sir Ricky, and congratulations on the project. That sounds really exciting. I'm sure a lot of Filipino studies scholars will benefit from that project. And good luck on your position, no, sa election. Thank you
Mhm.
very much, Sir Ricky, and to all our viewers. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you all had a great learning experience from this webinar. Thank you also to our SLS faculty for making this event possible. Special shout out to our hardworking and ever reliable tech team, Professor Nathan Isip and Professor Mark Santos and Professor Dan Dorado for managing the tech side of this event. Also to Professor Johan Frederick Cabab and Mr. Dij Paul Reyes for their work on the graphics and publicity materials. To give feedback and to request a certificate, please don't forget to register using the link shown on screen. This link will only be active for a month, so make sure to fill out the form before it expires. You can still leave an evaluation at any time. If you missed portions of this webinar, you may rewatch it as a Facebook video or check our YouTube channel. For updates on our upcoming activities, please follow us at our official Facebook page, that's UP SLIS, and subscribe to our YouTube and Twitch channels, youtube.com/UPSLIS and twitch.tv/UPSLIS. Or visit our website, slis.upd.edu.ph. You can catch our online talk shows on YouTube. We have For the Record, Faculty Room, the Student Produce Digital Scholarship Lecture Series, Coffee Break, Reflections and Conversations, and a new series called Off the Record, a student led spin off of For the Record series that discusses key concepts in archives and records management. Please like our videos on social media and don't hesitate to share it. So watch out for our next month's webinar offering. We'll be offering that on the first Wednesday of January. And that's a wrap up for our webinar Wednesday for the year of 2021. Once again, this is Paul Jason Perez, your host and moderator, wishing you all the best. See you soon. Paalam.